Chapter 6. I'll Fly Away. From Chi-Town to Shanghai. I would give Kanye the world if I could, but I guess I did the next best thing. I exposed him to the world. I knew that more than money, clothes, and things, exposure to new things, exposure to different things is perhaps the best gift you can give your child. My goal was to show Kanye the world so that he could make up his own mind how things work, but he would do it from experience. Kanye had his first plane ride when he was just 8 weeks old. We flew to Oklahoma City to attend my 10-year high school class reunion. This was 1977, and I was feeling pretty good. I had earned a couple of degrees, had traveled a good bit, and met people from all over the country and the world. But what I was most proud of was Kanye Omari West. My mother kept Kanye while I attended most of the events, but I had him strapped in a carrier to my front for a few gatherings. He was a great baby. At our class dinner, I got the prize for having the youngest child. I kept that prize, a baby bottle and two pacifiers, for years. We didn't have much use for the pacifiers, though, because Kanye had been sucking those two fingers since he came out of the womb, and that's all he wanted. I didn't need the bottle much either because I breastfed Kanye, but I appreciated the prize and was honored to have won. The trip to Oklahoma City was the first of many. Over the next few years, Kanye and I traveled at least a couple of times of each year, most frequently to Oklahoma City. But we also went to fun places like Florida. Glenda, one of Kanye's two godmothers, and I took Kanye and her daughter, Alexis, to Orlando and Daytona Beach. Disney World was some of the most fun ever. I loved it as much as Kanye did. In fact, I've been there 4 times, only twice with Kanye. On one of the trips, we found a place where you could record your own music video. This was before the days of karaoke, but it was similar. Kanye performed a Stevie Wonder tune. God only knows where that tape is today. Glenda and I rented a car and drove to SeaWorld. On the way, Glenda and I spotted these really cute guys driving in the car next to ours. Before I could even gear up to say anything, Alexis stuck her little head out of the back window and, pointing at her mother, said, "She's married." Glenda was faithful to her then husband, George. They're not together anymore, but Alexis was going to make sure nothing inappropriate happened that trip. Not that it ever would. It's funny how kids are so protective and perceptive. While in Disney, we went to one of those timeshare presentations. We had no intentions of purchasing one, but they rolled out the red carpet for us, complete with Disney characters to greet us. They even offered 2 days of free lodging and breakfast with the Disney characters just for checking them out. There was no obligation, and it was worth it all to see the smile on those kids' faces when Mickey and the whole crew came out to greet each kid personally at breakfast. I found it very important to expose my child to many things. Glenda and I were always finding places to take the kids, either out of town or right in Chicago. I wasn't rich or even well off. I always kept a house because I was taught that owning your own home is something that you simply must do. Renting was not an option. I found that it was usually cheaper to own a home than to rent anyway. And while I rarely denied Kanye anything, it wasn't because I had it like that. I was very clever in saving my money and finding ways to give him things and expose him to things without breaking our bank. Sometimes I would shuffle the bills to make sure he had something. I didn't make much as a professor, believe it or not, so I sometimes worked 2 or 3 jobs. I believe you do what you have to do to have the kind of life you want to have. I don't talk much about my struggles because I don't think about it that way. I just did what I felt I needed to do for me and my child. I had a vision for how I wanted things done with him. So I proceeded to just push ahead and make it happen. No complaints, no feeling sorry for not having more money or more help. I just did it. As our kids got older, Glenda and I increased their experiences. Every month we would take them to a different restaurant so they could experience different cuisines: Mexican, Japanese, even French. The trouble was, Kanye always wanted a hamburger and french fries, no matter where we were. He even asked for a hamburger at Benihana. He was not that impressed with the cooking at the table except for the tricks the chef did with the utensils. He just wanted his hamburger, but at least he was exposed to something different. Today, he tries just about everything. Another thing you do when you don't have much money is find free activities. One of my favorite free places to take Kanye was the Chicago Academy for the Arts. They offered art lessons for children on Saturdays. Kanye was a gifted artist, and I was thrilled that he had some place where he could get more training for no charge at all. I was surprised that he and Alexis were the only black kids in the class. They both took art lessons in Hyde Park, too. They, there were special classes on cartooning there. Since Kanye had already become interested in computer graphics and talked about going into animation, I thought this to be a golden opportunity to nurture his talent and see if he'd stick to it. He still draws today from time to time. I know that skill will be enormously helpful in his clothing designs soon to come. And it was nurtured for free, simply because I was active, keeping him active. Our trips within the city and beyond were incredibly educational. A lot of times, the hands on experiences ended up being a much more effective way for kids to learn rather than through some of the most traditional approaches. It makes children curious and enthusiastic about learning. Passive learning is often boring, a waste of time, and ultimately unfulfilling. Once Kanye and I took a Greyhound bus once from Chicago to Oklahoma City. The bus made several stops along the way, and one was in St. Louis. I wanted Kanye to see the Ark, which he had only seen in a photo in his geography book. I promised him we'd go there in person one day and see it up close. Our ride up and through the leaning arch in the little cars reminded me of a roller coaster. It was an exciting day that included a visit to the St. Louis Zoo. Kanye loved zoos and was fascinated by all the animals. It was a good trip, except for the bus ride itself. That was grueling. We suffered through the entire trip, spending much of it on the very last seats, the only two left on the bus, which would not recline. Kanye was only 6 and did not seem to mind at all, but I vowed then that we'd never travel by bus again if the trip was more than 2 hours. One of my favorite trips was our excursion to Washington, D.C. I wanted Kanye to see the White House and the Smithsonian Institute. We traced the steps of the March on Washington and even put our feet in the pool. Washington, D.C. was the perfect field trip. We saw so many sites that Kanye was learning about in school. He was especially fascinated by the Space Museum. We would have seen more, but money ran out before the fun did. But we'd seen and done a lot. Kanye and I traveled a bit when he was growing up. All that exposure was good, seeing people from different walks of life, but nothing compares to the experiences of leaving the good old US of A and seeing what's really happening in other parts of the world. I was blessed to be able to do that myself and bring my son along with me on some of those trips. As a kid, I thought those kinds of excursions were for the super rich and for those who'd joined the military. Since I belonged to neither of those groups, I was content with the idea of traveling around the United States, from New York to California. Yes, that sounded about right. I never even imagined going places as far away as Moscow, Russia. I never dreamed I would see Bombay. I never thought it was possible for me to live in China, as Kanye and I did for a year. But seeing those places and bringing slides and photos home for my son when he couldn't be there was an education that you just couldn't find in a textbook. My first trip outside the United States, except the 1 day trip when I was 21 to Tijuana, Mexico, was to India. Kanye didn't go along on that trip. He was only 3, and both his father and I thought it best that he stay home. Besides, I was part of the Fulbright Scholar Program, selected along with 10 other educators for a 9-week research project. We went to study life in India, particularly life for women and children. Our first stop was Madras. I remember going outside after checking into our hotel, looking up at the moon and thinking, wow, that's the same moon we see from 10,000 miles on the other side of the globe. It was sobering and at the same time exciting. My colleague and best friend, Brenda Cullen, had put together the trip and a very full itinerary. Working with two other professors who were natives of India, the plan was that we'd hit all the best spots. We would learn so much and meet so many interesting people and go to so many places. I'd never imagined a trip of this magnitude, much less my first real trip abroad. The hotel was modest, so modest that I was greeted in my room by a lizard who obviously thought I was invading his home. Thankfully, I wasn't afraid of a little green lizard, but my roommate almost broke an ankle when she jumped on the bed to get away from it. She was carrying on, showing her Western ways. The next morning, we left our hotel extra early so that we could visit the Gandhi Museum in New Delhi. For some reason, it had not been on the original itinerary, but I was extremely glad it was added. I have always admired Mahatma Gandhi and knew that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had learned a great deal from him about nonviolent protest. Since we were educators on the Fulbright Scholarship at that, we were offered the opportunity of meeting Indira Gandhi. As I shook her hand, I was humbled by her great work and reminded of the profound impact that Mahatma Gandhi had on the world. These are stories I would tell Kanye later, and I would expose him to as many places and cultures as I possibly could. In addition to Madras, we visited 8 other cities, including one of my favorites, Bombay. Bombay reminded me so much of Chicago, with the city sprawled right alongside the massive waters. The Taj Mahal, a place I'd only seen in pictures, was mesmerizing both at sunrise and sunset. We'd purposely gone at both times of day to witness the rising and setting of the sun. No less impressive were the beaches of Mahabalipuram, where I spent my first 30 where I spent my 31st birthday. It was amazing to wake up right on the beach. We slept in rooms that were outside, covered only with mosquito netting. Later that evening, there was a party. I had no idea there would be a huge cake for me, and even small gifts that my colleagues had gotten in town. After we'd eaten a meal fit for a queen, they sang happy birthday and we danced. When I awoke that morning from my mosquito netted room, I was astonished to see the long stretches of white sand almost completely empty. Only 2 gentlemen were on the beach, and to my amazement, one was actually levitating. We left Mahabalipuram a couple of days later and traveled to our next city. I was more interested in seeing the people, the way they lived or existed at least. As we drove down the road, it was not unusual to see places in the hills that had been carved out and made into dwellings. The spaces dug out of the dirt were about 7 feet long, 5 feet high, and 4 feet deep, and often housed a family of 6. Along the way, we'd stop at little shops or a place to eat. At one of these shops, we were approached by a young man carrying a child, who he held out to us and begging for money. The child was ashy black and extremely emaciated. He looked like an infant, but we were told he was 3 years old. We gave him some money and went into the shop. By the time we came out, he was on the ground, hovering over his child, who lay dead on the street. I shouldn't have been shocked, considering how he looked, skin and bones and ashy. I had seen other kids look like that throughout the town. It was a look of death that you just couldn't shake. I was deeply saddened. I had a 3-year-old back at home, so it was a little too close for me. I still think of it today. I can still see that little lifeless body and want to cry. I remember thinking how blessed I was not to be living under those circumstances. I thank God for giving me a healthy child, for giving me the means to keep him healthy. There are children in America who are starving and malnourished, but nothing compares in America with the poverty I saw in India. The worst projects and the poorest neighborhoods of Chicago look like Pennsylvania Avenue in D.C. compared to that. Then there was the contrast. Not more than a few miles away were temples encrusted with rubies and emeralds. I was aware of their customs and religious beliefs, but I still could not understand how temples could be filled with so many precious stones while just miles away children were dying of hunger. The 9 weeks in India went quickly, and I couldn't wait to get back to my beautiful, healthy child. I made a detour, though, to Germany to visit my dear friend Ernie Fay and her husband Kevin, who was stationed in Wiesbaden. I spent just a few days there, even checked out a wine fest in the nearby town. I still have the little glasses the wine was served in. There was so much free flowing wine that if I hadn't been careful, we'd have been crawling home. I bought more souvenirs for family and friends, but most of my purchases were for Kanye. By this time, I was consumed, even in the beautiful hills of Wiesbaden, by the thought of getting back home to my child. I missed him terribly. I vowed I would never be away from my child that long again. So when I got the opportunity to spend a year in China teaching English as part of an exchange program that Nanjing University in People's Republic of China had with Chicago State University, I was I was going to turn it down. But the chairperson of the English department, Dr. Jesse Green, made it clear that I could take Kanye with me. My main concern, besides all of the expenses being paid and receiving my regular salary, was my son. I couldn't see leaving him for a month, let alone an entire year, and I didn't have to. It was an offer I couldn't refuse. I knew very little about China except what I had read or seen on television, which wasn't much at all. It wasn't even on my list of places to visit, but intuitively, I knew that living in China for a year would be the opportunity of a lifetime. I began studying the language some and preparing for the journey. Soon, Kanye and I were on a plane headed to China. That seemed like the longest plane ride ever, but we finally landed. We disembarked and followed the instructions I'd been given. But the plane was early, and the university officials who were to meet us had not arrived. Everything was so foreign, of course. The people, the language, the signs, the customs. We waited for about 45 minutes, not knowing what to do. Then, two professors and a student from Nanjing University showed up to greet us. Our adventure began. Our first taste of China was the traffic. There were bicycles everywhere. I learned later that only those employed by the government drove private cars. It was understandable. With the streets so jam packed with bicycles, there would have been no room for that many cars. Kanye was 10 and one of the only foreign children who had come to spend the entire year. He made a few friends quickly. One of them was Diego, a Mexican boy about Kanye's age, who had already been there for half the year. His parents both taught Spanish. About 10 professors or foreign experts, as we were called, had come from across the globe to work in the foreign language department there. I and several other professors from the United States, Trevor from England, Ellie from France, Larissa from Russia, Diego's parents from Mexico, and a wonderful lady from Germany who lived in the apartment right across the hall from us in the Foreign Experts building on campus. The only other kid there was a little French boy. He was quite a bit younger than Kanye and Diego, and rather spoiled, everyone thought. He was happy only when he was right under his parents. Within an hour after we arrived, Diego's parents consented to let him accompany us for dinner in the Jingling Hotel, which was very nice, Western style hotel we often went to when we wanted American food. It's not that we wanted it that day, but it was recommended as an excellent place to have dinner, so we decided to go there. Diego had already been in China for 6 months and had become pretty fluent in Chinese. He would be our interpreter for those first months until Kanye learned the language pretty well. I found Chinese to be very difficult, with its four tones and inflections that had to be pronounced just so. Kanye had fun with it. He thought it was so amusing. that the word ma pronounced one way meant mama, but the same word pronounced with a different inflection meant horse. He played that to the hilt. Every day in China brought a new and exciting experience. Within that first week, I purchased a bike for both Kanye and myself, and we soon learned to navigate through the traffic with the best of them. It was our primary means of transportation, just like everyone else's. We'd ride for miles. Kanye rode his bike to school every day, which was about 6 or 8 blocks away from the campus. He was the only foreign kid in his class. Although he was 10, he'd been put in first grade because of the language barrier. I thought it would be awkward for him, but he adjusted quickly. He learned math, some science, and especially the language, and for the most part got along well with the other kids. The teachers seemed to adore him. He was no doubt a novelty and the first black kid they'd seen in person. I was pretty annoyed that when the Chinese children would see Kanye, they'd yell, "Break dance, break dance." They didn't know much English, if any at all, but they knew break dance. It was very stereotypical to me, but maybe the stereotype was based on the American culture as a whole, not just on Kanye being black. Still, I was annoyed. It should not have surprised me to learn one day that Kanye had been putting his breakdancing skills to use. He could spin on his head and everything. Fearing he might break his neck or something, I always forbade him to do it. One day, as he approached me, I noticed he was eating a skewer of sheep meat. You could purchase it on the streets, and we'd long since gotten over our hesitancy about eating the meat, which had not been refrigerated, much less approved by the USDA. I had not given Kanye any money, though. I wondered how he'd bought the sheep meat. He'd been charging the kids to see him breakdance. I was amused and not altogether happy about it at the same time. I discouraged his little capitalistic venture, but I never really checked up to see if he continued. As long as he'd leave out the spinning on his head part, I wasn't upset enough to put the fear of God in him about doing it. I never saw him with more skewers, though. Maybe he stopped. Things were going pretty well. Usually, the greatest of our worries was having to endure being stared down every time we went out, not by just a few, but by everybody. In China, staring is not rude, and of course, neither Kanye nor I were regular scenery. Sometimes we didn't feel like being stared at, so we didn't venture out. One time, though, we were in a small shop in the middle of Confucius Temple. In walked a group of Chinese, pointing and staring at Kanye. Before I knew it, Kanye had whirled around toward them and suddenly shouted, "Gun Hun Ku," which in Chinese means, "Get back." Quicker than lightning, those people made their exit. Kanye, I'm sure, felt vindicated. He'd made them go away and stop staring, if only for a moment. Even the loud command to get back paled in comparison to the incident that brought me to the school one day. Kanye had done the unthinkable. It was a cold winter day in China. There was no heat in the classrooms, at least not south of a certain point. It was very cold in all the classrooms in grade school and on the college campus where I taught. Everyone wore a coat, hat, and gloves to try to keep warm. Kanye had on all of that, but his gloves were the regular ones we had bought from the States. All the Chinese kids wore gloves with no fingers in them. I suppose they could write better. Upon seeing Kanye's gloves were not fingerless, his teacher approached Kanye to take his gloves. She probably said in Chinese, "You can't wear those gloves in here." Well, she did try to take the gloves, but didn't quite get away with them. A tug of war ensued. Kanye was pulling on one end of the gloves and the teacher on the other. It was on, and the language barrier didn't help. Not being able to get the gloves from the teacher and put them back on his freezing hands, all of a sudden Kanye kicked the teacher and retrieved his gloves. I couldn't believe my ears when I heard what had happened. I was furious with Kanye. I had raised him never to kick anyone, much less a teacher or any elder. And yet it happened. Immediately, the university arranged for an interpreter to accompany me to the school, and we all went trekking up the hill, so that Kanye could apologize. When we got there, the teacher was waiting. She explained what had happened to the interpreter, who of course translated to me. I told Kanye how disappointed I was and that he must never do that again. Looking toward the floor, Kanye apologized. Then I explained to the teacher that while I would never condone Kanye's behavior, he would have to wear his gloves in the classroom. We could not risk frostbite in exchange for Chinese customs. He'd have to be allowed to wear regular gloves with the fingers in them on the bitter cold days, or he'd miss school on those days. It was settled. The teacher understood. Kanye wore his gloves from then on. There was one last matter to address, however. Kanye, I said, you know you're to look at people when you're speaking to them. Eye contact is important. Why in the world would you look down at the floor? He then explained to me that to look at the teacher would have been rude and disrespectful. I had never realized that until that day. The year in China was full of learning opportunities and outright fun. Kanye and I both became friends with the African students there who studied at one of three universities in the area and learned to love the African cuisine. We went to many places in the city as well as around China. The Great Wall of China was one of them. Never was I so tired when we climbed Yellow Mountain, though. That took a full day. I'd wanted to ride the cable car up and down, but Kanye insisted on the climb, and I was too chicken to let him go with just my colleagues. The mountain has lots of dangerous places, and if you're not careful, it could be the last mountain you'll climb. But we made it and got ready to take the drive back to Nanjing. It was a 6-hour drive from Yellow Mountain to Nanjing on very bumpy roads. My legs were so swollen when we arrived back on campus that I couldn't walk and had to be carried to the apartment. In the end, it was worth it. Bumpy roads, swollen legs, and all. Nothing was any more beautiful than Yellow Mountain. At Christmas time, Glenda and Alexis came to visit. Lots of people said they would visit during the course of our being there, but the only ones who made it were Glenda and Alexis. The Chinese didn't celebrate the birth of Christ, nor exchange gifts, of course, and Kanye and I were quite homesick. But when we picked up Glenda and Alexis from the airport, our whole demeanor changed. It was the four of us, along with my student, Cheng Dong Bing, who traveled with us. She was also Kanye's sitter and language teacher and was a lifesaver, booking tickets, getting cabs, and showing us the sights. It was more than an adventure and not easy, but Dong Bing made it totally pleasurable and educational as well. Once, Kanye and I literally took the slow boat from Canton to Hong Kong, where we'd spent 2 weeks before going to visit Thailand. Around the Chinese New Year, everybody went on a 6-week holiday from the university. I decided on Hong Kong and Thailand, since Japan was much too expensive. In Hong Kong, we stayed in what became known as Slum King Mansion. The bath was down the hall and the room was definitely no frills. The cost was 11 US dollars a night, if that tells you anything. But it's what I could afford, and besides, who stays in a room while in Hong Kong? When we got to Thailand, we visited Bangkok first. Kanye went right along to the red light district with me. I wanted to see it, and I certainly was not going to leave him in the hotel with some sitter I hardly knew. From there, it was on to Koh Samu. The beaches there are some of the most beautiful in the world. I was totally embarrassed though when one of the professors, also a Catholic priest, asked Kanye what was the favorite part of his holiday. Kanye answered, the nude beaches in Thailand. One of the many great things about being in China was that we could afford a lot of what we would not have been able to afford in the States. Kanye took Tai Chi lessons and got quite good at it. He also took private art lessons twice a week. We had private tutors in the evening, mainly Ezra, an African student from Zimbabwe. so that he would not be behind in his studies when we returned home. We would not have been able to afford any of this had we not been in China. Heck, I even got acupuncture every other day. Each treatment was $1.50. I'd lost my thyroid medication and thought acupuncture would work just as well, if not better. It did. Without a doubt, living in China was a once in a lifetime experience that neither of us will ever forget. I believe Kanye has forgotten all but one or two words of the language now. Languages are not like riding a bicycle. If you don't use it, you'll lose it. But I can envision us there on that campus and all about the city as though it were yesterday. I'm sure Kanye can as well. We were on the go a lot from Chi Town to Shanghai, and even took a ski trip or two to Wisconsin when both Kanye and Alexis were older. Glenda and I drank hot chocolate by the fireplace while they stayed on skis all day. It was just one more experience that contributed, I think, to well roundedness. If I had to point to any one thing that made a world of difference in Kanye, I would point to his exposure through travel. We didn't have a lot of money and were not able to see the world as he does now. But the exposure he did have was key in learning firsthand about different cultures and customs. When we didn't have money to do it up close, when we didn't have money to do it up close and personal, we did it through books, museums, and eventually the internet. My hope is that more kids will have such experiences. I was lucky being a professor because there were a lot of travel perks. That's how we got from Chi Town to Shanghai.